Okay, so welcome, Dr. Eleanor Drage. Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So for the people that are connected here checking this video out, Dr. Eleanor Drage is a Christina Naw postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Gender Studies and a member of the Gender and Technology Research Project team. She started her career in financial technology before co-founding an e-commerce company. And she graduated with an international dual PhD from the University of Bologna and the University of Granada in 2019, where she was an early stage researcher for the EU horizon of the 2020 ITN Marie Curie project called GRACE. It's an honor to having you here. I'm very happy that you agreed to having this interview, so welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. Perfect. And for the very kind introduction, all those, you managed to get through all of the EU, the long taglines that they have for each project. So well done.
Yeah, we can get into that what all those acronyms mean. Yeah. So, well, essentially, I have 10 questions prepared for you, and feel free to add any other content that you like to express. Okay. So the first question is about your academic trajectory. What key attitudes and strategies do you consider an academic has to develop across the years to make substantial progress on her field? And personally speaking, how have you managed to stay motivated and focused on your work across time?
So I'm hoping this will be useful then for all the kind of budding academics watching. Surely it depends from field to field, because I mean, the great thing about Cambridge is that you can have lunch with people in your colleges every day, and there's people from many different disciplines. So I'll sit next to a scientist that hasn't had nearly the same academic trajectory as me, and very different things are necessary in order to stay at the top of your field or whatever. So I can only speak to my experience, and I'm not sure I have stayed focused. I've, as you've read out, done a bunch of different stuff. Good. And in many ways it's all been helpful for where I am now. I worked for a couple of years in tech companies. I hated it. It was really boring. It wasn't me at all. And actually that experience has turned into something valuable at this stage, working with a tech company now, which I'll talk about a bit later. And also giving me an idea of how to write in a way that's not academic, because I think you can get so caught up when writing papers in a particular style, needing to sound a certain kind of way. And I had to spend a year writing blog posts for a fintech company and a kind of Airbnb style company. And then you learn to get rid of the faff and the nonsense way of writing that you learn through school, and to streamline things down into simple expressions that people can understand. And that's been so helpful now with all the public comms work I do. You have to be able to explain what you're doing in my field, because it's gender studies and you have to justify why you're there. You can't just take the money and run like you can in STEM. You have to really constantly feed back to the people that fund you, to the companies that you work with. Every time you want a pay raise, you have to explain how you've done public outreach and really what impact that's had.
Great. Well, great response. I really connect with the idea of being multidisciplinary. There are many philosophers, I mean, across the ages. You can have, Aristotle, David Hume, Kant, they all taught a wide range of subjects and disciplines. And I think that's very powerful, because the reality is very complex, right? So it's tough to only see one aspect. Like you have to see the wider picture. And I'm happy that you are at a place you're proud of, and you've done a lot of stuff. So sure. That's also good. That's a good recommendation as well.
Thanks. And I think, on the kind of philosophers that you brought up, there is this idea that you have to be some kind of genius. And I think, watching people at Cambridge, you have those, certainly the people who appear to be those kind of genius types. But then there's a lot of people that are actually just really interested in something. Academic knowledge is a specific interest, an in-depth interest in a specific thing. And if you love it and you're really passionate about it, and you find the time to keep researching, to keep looking, to keep exploring, you see that that is intelligence in itself. intelligence is collective. It comes from hard work and research. It's about being interested just as much as being interesting, I think.
Amazing. Yeah, I really connect with that as well. As I mentioned before we start recording, now I'm working on something I'm really deeply interested in, and in a context that I'm really deeply interested in. And about language in philosophy and gender studies, and especially in a corporate context, I know exactly what you mean. As I mentioned, I'm working with a French company here in Mexico, and we are doing a project where, well, language is essential everywhere, but when you go outside of academia, you have to really be, you have to use the correct words, be concise, don't extend too long. So it's been a great experience, and I'm happy you say that even from inside academia. I think that's an important thing to recognize.
For sure.
Very well. So moving on to, this is a question about the Center for Gender Studies. Could you tell us a bit about your work in this center, Center for Gender Studies at the University of Cambridge, and what projects have you been working on?
So I have a complicated research project because it's based between two centers. The center that you were interested, Center for the Future of Intelligence,
yes,
which is a Leverhulme funded center, and is a kind of non-permanent center at Cambridge. And on the other hand, the Center for Gender Studies. And you may think, what do these two centers possibly have in common? But CFI is really great because it's one of the AI institutes really that's looking at a really closely at what ethics actually means. It's not taking a universalist approach. It's being really specific about the kinds of epistemologies, the forms of knowledge that go into trying to make technologies less harmful. So feminist, post-colonial, decolonial, anti-racist ways of thinking. And these coincide very nicely with groups of people that are doing very technical things, or looking into existential risk, or politics. And so we have these fantastic team meetings where there's lots of different people almost doing sort of contradictory things, and we have a lot of great discussion because of that. Gender studies, of course, is a no man's land. It's a center that's always moved between departments, and it's at the moment in the politics faculty at Cambridge. And what this means is that it's interdisciplinary. And so gender is not a thing in and of itself, but a lens through which to understand power dynamics more broadly. So the center offers, you can look at gender through medtech, through science, through politics, through language, through literature. And that's always been the way that I've studied gender studies, is that it's useful everywhere. Well, that's what we try and convince people anyway.
Of course.
So the project that we're working on is funded by a philanthropist from Hong Kong, Tina Gore. And our principal investigator on the project is Professor Jude Brown, and she's an expert in gender and politics, amongst other things. And we are working with a big tech company. So we're very lucky to be working with a company that's the size of Facebook. I can't tell you who it is. Wow. Because we've signed an NDA. Okay. But we get to talk to, so we're interviewing engineers, people in HR, all sorts of areas of the company. And we're asking them what they think about ethics. What is ethical technology? What is good technology? And what are the problems that they face when trying to make their systems safer for people? And we're trying to see whether these big ethics frameworks like, and UNESCO's or the EU AI Act, everyone has one, Rolls-Royce, you name it, right? And it's kind of you can call it ethics washing if you're having a bad day. It depends what you think, whether you think that they're useful or not. But we showed that they're not really meaningful or impactful to people working on the ground, to real life engineers.
Yeah, definitely. Because one thing is what's written on paper and how all the principles and all I imagine there's also a lot of marketing, and it gets really muddy, right? It's very tough. But then when you look at the facts, you look at what's really happening on companies and on software platforms, it may be a different picture, and I'm sure it often is. I like how you framed the gender studies, because initially one would think it would be sociology, right, or maybe philosophy, but it's actually everywhere. It's in every aspect of the way people live their lives, right? So that view should be, I think, expressed more broadly. More people should understand that. And well, and congratulations on the project. Wow, and what a big responsibility you have. In your voice, there's a voice of millions of women out there, and I'm happy that you're working on this.
Thanks. I think your point also on marketing is really important because, I mean, I worked in digital marketing to begin with, and thought that it was kind of, pointless and horrific at the time. And now looking at the marketing materials for AI, different kinds of AI products that may or may not be AI, like recruitment software. I don't know whether I can talk about this later, but we can't access the algorithms because they're proprietary. So we can't know whether or not these kinds of AI systems that claim to be able to identify a good candidate from looking at their face really work. So we look at the marketing materials and we say, okay, well, what are the strategies that they claim, that they take in order to claim to be able to do this, and work out how they relate to ideas from gender studies. So can you work out personality from somebody's face? Can you eradicate race and gender from someone's body and be left with this neutral data point that you can assess, that you can use to assess with other across a broader candidate pool? And probably not, right? Sorry, these are my pinging. These my pinging emails, or?
No, I don't. I didn't listen. Oh, good.
Okay.
I didn't hear. Yeah.
And this is a huge problem in AI because marketing is such hype. This is capitalism. You can't stop people from marketing their products in an enthusiastic way, but you can stop them from making nonsense claims. And regulation is so far behind. We must regulate the way that companies market their products so that we get away from this kind of hype. We must warn people within companies about the hype around AI, what AI can and can't do, and so that you have to go through a much stricter process every time you buy in a third-party product than what's currently happening.
Definitely. I mean, you touched some serious points there, in the sense that there's a lot of hype going on, and people, when we say AI, we can mean a bunch of things. And as you said, sometimes it's not even precisely AI, it's something else. And people just use it as such, because when there's hype around the technology and there's some proof that it works, well, in a capitalist context would be that it makes revenue, right? It produces capital. Then a bunch of hype goes in, and then a bunch of marketing goes out, and people start getting confused. Yeah. And then you have regulation, which is as you said, it should be better. And I could add, imagine how it is over here in Latin America. It's years and years behind. So it's a long battle, but I'm happy that you are fighting the fight over there, and that spreads around the world, because once principles start working, because one thing is having principles, and then the other thing is that they work, turn to legislation and fines, and then it starts really to make impact around the world. So I recently wrote a paper on the impact of AI in Latin America, right? Because sometimes I see that people generalize some impacts around the world, but there's different effects on different regions. So I think people should be more and more aware. There should be more awareness. I argue for better understanding of these technologies, because if we don't bring the understanding to a certain level, it's going to be very difficult for people to voice their concerns about this technology, right? So anyway,
this is a really crucial point. What is the best way of explaining things, not just explaining things to the public, but involving the public in getting them to bring their knowledge into the equation as well, because I think this sort of patronizing idea that knowledge trickles down from engineers to the public is really not, I'm sure you agree, what we need. Actually, our PI, Jude Brown, talks a lot about, she's thinking about mini publics. So small groups that are funded, publicly funded, that come to make decisions about AI products, and they bring together people from many different kinds of demographics and industries, and they can make those kinds of a bit like a jury, that you get pulled in, the kind of jury service, sort of a similar setup.
There's the AI narratives project as well in the CFI, right? There's the AI narratives and global AI narratives, which is involving more and more people into this, right?
Yes, they mainly look at science fiction and those kinds of narrativizations of AI, which is how I got into this, because I missed kind of, as a weird mistake, did a PhD in science fiction. I'd meant to apply for something else and got confused.
Me?
Yeah.
Wow.
But it was great. And I argue that science fiction is a mode of political theory in itself. So it's a way of explaining philosophy in a way that's interesting and accessible to the public. And it does a lot of the things that feminist, anti-racist, and feminist post-humanist ideas do, but just in a kind of more visual, more exciting, more accessible
with metaphors,
way.
With more, Well, so moving on, because I have more questions about this, but I mean, let's keep moving forward. Okay, so about studying philosophy, right? So, what is the role of the philosopher today? In this complex, highly complex, really fast world.
Yeah.
And how do you think this role is different from previous roles across previous ages?
Across time.
Yeah, across time.
I wonder whether we overstate the differences often between philosophers now and philosophers in different eras. I think that philosophers have always had, in fact, have probably been more prominent in public circles in days gone by than today. My, great idol going into this job was Stiegler, the French philosopher, who spent a lot of time, and because it's France, and so people just do think that philosophy has a place.
That's a nice thought, right?
In government decisions, or working with, in healthcare. He'd bring all these different people together, and
how do you pronounce? How do you pronounce the last name of this philosopher? I'm not a
Stiegler, Stiegler.
Okay.
He was amazing, the kind of last rock star philosopher of our generation, I think. Although, the great thing about doing feminist and anti-racist stuff is that, you start really from Gramsci onwards. And then a lot of the philosophers that I work with are alive today. And that means I can chat to them, on the podcast and stuff. And that's
big privilege.
Isn't it amazing? Rather than thinking, I wonder what Plato would have said, you get to
it is I only wonder, we can keep reading what we have, right, the fragments and the books, but it's something else. It's completely different experience.
Exactly. I personally have to do a lot, as I said, of public facing work, but different kinds of philosophy. We have great arguments among philosophers in AI ethics. For those of you who think that AI ethics is one kind of happy family, absolutely not. And it depends on what philosophical tradition you're going with, whether you want to teach just a kind of Western philosophy approach, if you can even define analytic philosophy as analytic philosophy. Lots of people are kind of offended by that term in and of itself. I'm coming from feminist theory and philosophy, that's very much embedded in activism. So it's an activist practice. So we can't possibly just sit around. You have to also be part of movements, engaged with real violence, with real harm and abuse, and what those consequences are. And that's always where we write from. We look at real life harms.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. That maybe
no, please.
Perhaps I remember you told me a few weeks ago, a few weeks ago, that you were in a strike there in the UK, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
really involved.
This is because there's been big pension cuts, despite we have a very wealthy pension pot at Cambridge, but for lots of different reasons, we've still had real-term pay cuts to our pensions, or also actual pay cuts to our salaries. And this is despite inflation, despite the rising cost of living. And we have at Cambridge the greatest pay gap in terms of race and gender than any other university in the UK. Wow. We have our USP at Oxford and Cambridge is that you get 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 supervisions, these amazing ways of learning where it's just you and one other professor or something. And often it's PhD students or postdocs that take those supervisions. They're not paid for training. They're on 0-hour contracts. The precarity of that labor is enormous. And a lot of the people that you see coming out on the picket lines to protest are humanities people, because the STEM people can segue into working for AstraZeneca. So it's
yes
exactly. But there's something amazing about standing on a picket line saying, we want better for our pensions next to some expert in Shakespeare or the people that have written these top books. It was an amazing experience, and I made incredible friends. And now actually they're helping me negotiate my salary. So the union plays a really important role in saying we'll have a union representative there so that you don't get screwed over in these negotiations.
This is something we
if you're not a member, join the union.
This is something we have to learn over here on this side of the world. Like impact can happen, change can happen. And getting out and doing something very well organized, with respect, with knowledge, with understanding, really can make a difference. I've seen strikes. I mean, if we look at the history of strikes, there's a lot going on in Europe and in the US, the UK, and over here it's kind of starting. It's people are taking themselves and the governments more seriously.
Yeah, and I think that even if you don't see those, radical shifts from day to day, why has something not happened? Part of that, of being politically sensitive, is what Spivak calls the daily acts of you're brushing your teeth every day, kind of political tartar control, where you're constantly you're constantly attuned to what's going on, you're talking to people, you're making friends, and this is so important. And perhaps it was more like this, being a philosopher 50, 60 years ago, there was more of those relationships, but they're so important just so that we can stay afloat, and that those friendships are just vital in for mental health, but also for the relationships that we need to make ideas travel. Definitely.
Wow, really hit the spot there. I like the metaphor you used, that it's something about tartar control, right? It's kind of funny, but I mean, it's something we have to do, not occasionally, it has to be done every day, all the time. So, well, moving forward, going back to gender, and now speaking about gender and technology, could you please share your views on this relationship between gender and technology? I know we started talking about it, and perhaps share a bit about the gender and technology research project, right? Like this complex connection.
Yeah. I started thinking about it, I think, reading Teresa de Lauretis's Technologies of Gender, where she argues that film, fiction, and theory are all technologies of gender. And I thought, well, what is gender then? And certainly what is technology? And on our podcast, we ask people these questions all the time. And they often come back to us saying, well, pencils are technologies. And from Stiegler, the guy I was talking about before, he defined technology as techne, as the unthought of philosophy, and he looked at as its origin story, the myth of Prometheus and Epimetheus, when Epimetheus handed out all these attributes to the animals, and the giraffe had a long neck, and birds had feathers, could fly, and he got to humans and actually had ran out of gifts, and so we had nothing. And so then Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. And so we are not well adapted to our environment. We need houses and clothes and all these things that we have to use to make life livable. So we adopt rather than adapt. So we adopt technologies. That's what makes us human. And I really liked this idea because it shows that humanity and technology are not separate. We are really interlinked. They are co-constitutive, and we can define each other through each other only. Gender is a way, as I said before, of understanding power more broadly, and gender, as Gayatri Spivak said, is the oldest globalizer. It's everywhere. Yeah. It's about power and control. When it comes to AI, which is what I look at specifically, I think that AI defines itself through its proximity to these masculinist ideals of power and speed and efficiency, and you can trace those back to the Enlightenment or even before, and also through its distance from feminist labor, from feminist aesthetics. Now more than ever, as Judy Wackman and Erin Young have pointed out, our AI workforce is really largely men. There's way less women now working in technology than there were when women were the first computers. So it's important to constantly look out, to constantly look out for how that kind of labor has been divided. Some kinds of AI labor is more important than others. If you're labeling data in a workshop in India, you're likely to be paid very little. It's likely to be feminized labor. It's definitely racialized labor. Whereas if you're working in head office in Apple, you're way more likely to be a white guy. So it's not that AI is only full of men. It's a lot of women in it, but those women are invisibilized, as Caroline Criado Perez has pointed out.
One would think that in Silicon Valley, they're working on this. I mean, one would think that, and sometimes they kind of try to show that on the outside, but again, when you look at the facts, at reality, it's not so. And it saddens me that the history of technology has essentially been this, like heterosexual white males, right? Like they design the technology, they deploy the technology, and they reap the benefits. And this is a very difficult thing, because as well, like knowledge accumulates, wealth accumulates, and then technology also ends up sprouting on those contexts, right?
Sure, and it is about wealth, because there's loads of women and disabled communities who've invented technologies over time, but they're not seen as inventors. So a few of the people that we've interviewed, Meryl Alper, for example, talks about Cynthia Bennett's also another expert in tracing histories of disabled communities that invent, and acknowledging them as inventors, acknowledging them as high technologists rather than just as users. Same with women. These amazing histories now that we have that show that women have invented. Look at Ada Lovelace, and those women need to be brought into the foreground because they existed. And so the workforce now just isn't reflective of those histories, nor is it reflective of the competencies of different demographics more broadly.
Yeah, there's that phrase that whoever wins the battle tells the story, right? So in retrospective, I'm sure there's not a lot of credit, appropriate credit to whoever invented those. I'm sure there's a lot of appropriation of technologies by men. Well, moving on now, well, more specifically, still on technology and gender, but now more specifically to AI and gender, right? How is artificial intelligence, and by artificial intelligence, I mean artificial narrow intelligence, right? So that would be computer vision, algorithms that detect different kinds of how can I put it? Well, efficiency, right? To put it in a way, natural language processing, chatbots, etc. I'm talking about what we use every day since we wake up until we go to sleep. How is that technology impacting gender equality? And how can anti-sexist critical theory help us understand this relation and make it more nuanced, right? Make it more open?
There's so much to say about that. And I think that it's nice that you listed different kinds of technologies, because it's really good to be specific. I'm not a Luddite.
What? I'm sorry.
I'm not a Luddite. I love technology, and
okay, yeah.
AI can be used in really interesting ways.
People can think that about our kind of work as well. Yeah.
And I think if you talk to somebody who's building an AI system that's connecting, I don't know, engineers to networks or something, they'll say, what are you talking about? Or they'll define their system very differently than they would if you're talking about machine vision or facial recognition or something.
Yeah.
So, AI can be used in many very, very different specific ways. And machine learning is not necessarily going to be used for, it's going to be used for all different kinds of purposes. Yeah. I look at things like, I don't know whether you've heard of Geophilia and Data Miner.
No.
Don't worry. They are two companies that they created relationships with social media companies like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And through those relationships, they had access to the API, which is where the kind of interface where you can have access to the data. And they use that for what they call event detection. And the language here they use is really important. So they say, okay, well, we can go through loads and loads of different kinds of data from social media and from other data sources and identify a fire before anyone knows that there's a fire happening, because we can use a bit of machine vision to say, oh, look, there's a little bit of smoke in the right-hand corner of the screen. And we know that smoke, so we think there's going to be a fire, and somebody tweeted about smoke in the vicinity.
Wow.
And then they'll send out a real-time alert to a company that signs on with them. Now, interestingly, those relationships with the companies, we think, make all the difference. So if it's the fire brigade, that's one thing. If it's the Boston Police Department, that could be something else. So with both of them, what they're trying to do is make data actionable. So data is never objective or raw. It's always used for something. It's always made useful. And that process of making data useful reshapes the world. That is literally a process of world building, of creating events rather than just identifying them. And we know through gender studies that that's called performativity.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the idea that we don't pre-exist. Gender doesn't pre-exist the world, but is brought into existence through it. The gender doesn't precede the body even, but you are gendered as you grow up, as you move through these social cues, these social norms.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the roots of this idea come from Beauvoir, right? Simone de Beauvoir, is that correct?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can say that she was the first constructivist, saying that you're not born, you become.
Yeah.
Enormously influential, even to those who don't necessarily understand the profound impact of what she was saying. Similar ideas were voiced.
Phenomenology of gender, right? Yeah.
Sure. Were voiced before, but yeah. So it's kind of amazing to see the impact that this has now in AI. So I'll say what happens. The bad thing is this, is that is that
go to the bad thing, explain it.
Is that these companies were also claiming to be able to identify protests. And in order to identify a protest, you have to train a system to be able to want to decide what a protest is and isn't. A protest is what? A group of people, a crowd in the street. And they trained it on data from the Black Lives Matter protests. So what that's doing is saying, the computer learns, okay, we've got all these bodies gathered in this place. These bodies are largely Black bodies. They're largely bodies holding signs saying BLM, saying things about the police, defund the police. And so it's learning a racialized conception of what counts as a dangerous event, not just a normal event, because no one cares whether it's a kind of, if it's a peaceful protest, the police doesn't really need to know, but they think it's going to turn violent, and they literally associate Blackness and anti-racism with, with a protest. Now, what they could also do, right, I talked about social media, is identify people, is take people's Instagram accounts and say, okay, lots of people have shared photos from a protest, have uploaded a picture of themselves, put it on Instagram. Lots of people do this now. and they could get the police department to run those photos against the Boston Police Department's own database of images of people with the warrants out for their arrest. And if your photo matched, then they can go into the protest and arrest you.
Oh, wow. Oof. A really good friend of mine from London, actually, and he would make a great guest for your podcast. I'll connect you later. I think you could be interested. His name is Dr. Fintan Nagel. He explained one thing, something related to this, which is in the US. I don't remember the exact moment or city, but it's essentially in the US, they deployed an algorithm that sent police to where they thought there was going to be a lot of crime, right? Like they
predictive policing.
Exactly. And they decided on one area and started sending police, and then suddenly they started recording a bunch of crimes on that area. And but then it turns out that there was a problem in the algorithm, and it should have been sent to another place. And they concluded that it didn't really matter to where they sent, because wherever you send a lot of police, they're going to capture a lot of crime, because and then it starts to spiral,
Sure.
More crimes, and it gets very, very messy. Right?
So the point is that there is no such thing as predictive anything. AI doesn't predict because it uses past data. So what it does is base all decisions on the past, and they have to be based on the past, because
reasoning, right? Hume would be mad, right? The problem of inductive reasoning.
Sure. But this is the thing, is that, machine learning can't validate a decision as correct if it's not correct according to its training data. So that's all you're left with. So we're saying you can't call these tools predictive. We must use other language. Wow. Same with facial identification. It's not really an identification so much as affecting a commentary on a face. And you can't detect somebody's gender or sexuality from your face. That's nonsense. It's in the words of Oz Keyes, bullshit. We need to stop thinking that we can.
That's true. Wow. Yeah. It's thorny problems that we decided to work on. But someone has to get involved in this. More people have to get involved in this, because it's really on very few hands that are taking the big decisions. So moving on to your podcast, the Good Robot podcast. I'm a fan. I've seen some episodes. I haven't seen them all, of course. There's a lot of content to explore and reflect, but often when I drive around, I put on the podcast. Could you tell us about this podcast and what's the story behind it? And the big question is, why do you do it, I think?
Well, I'm so thrilled that you listen to it. It's such a strange thing with a podcast that you release into the world, and you're like, oh, I don't actually have 6,000 friends. So who are these people that are listening? It's great. We wanted to do something during lockdown, that was connecting, it was meaning to build relationships, and all these philosophers and, people at Google were sitting at home. And everybody said yes. So we had amazing conversations with people that we possibly wouldn't have got hold of otherwise. And this is a huge range of people. So for anyone who's wondering what feminist perspectives on technology are, we define feminism very broadly. We include Buddhist monks at MIT, like Tenzin and Priyadarshi. We include feminist philosophers like Rosie Braidotti and Jack Halberstam. We include young, amazing youth activists like Sneha Ravana. And all these people give very different, almost contradictory ideas of what good technology is and what feminist work does. A lot of people, some people define feminism as an activist tradition that works for women. Other people, women doesn't matter at all, and it's about making life livable, in Judith Butler's terms, for the most marginalized, for the people who've been dispossessed, poorly treated because of technology.
Wow, amazing. So I'll put the information of your podcast information on the description. I think it's good that when you said that there's a lot of counter arguments and contradiction on this, I think it enriches the conversation, because I think at least what I've been seeing in online and with some friends, that there's a lot of, well, it's no secret, right, that the world is polarized in many areas, right? And I think rich conversations in podcasts that include philosophical thought and this, these studies are really something that brings people closer together. Like if you have only one way of looking at something, it's something, but then you have 10 and you start synthesizing in your mind, right? And it becomes clearer.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the big problems, is that, my mom is a feminist, and yet we so disagree about so much stuff. It's the cause of, permanent tension. And we need to be able to reach across the aisle. Obviously, it's harder with your own parents, but to acknowledge the different kinds of feminist work that people have done across the ages and say, okay, that thing was important for that moment in time. And otherwise, this is the problem, and that has left us with the culture wars, is that we're not reading older generations of feminist or philosophical traditions. We're not reading, great Braidotti's, this great philosopher came on and said, why are people not reading Alice Walker? Sarah Franklin, who's the head of sociology at Cambridge, said, nobody's reading Shulamit Firestone. We need to go back and appreciate all the stepping stones that were necessary for us to get to this point.
Yeah, that's something else that's something really important, because people just take one word and they think there's only one definition and no history at all. And I mean, as a ancient Greek philosophy teacher, instructor, people start to they just want to see what's up today. They want to understand, But if you take the time to see the stepping stones, as you mentioned, it gets much clearer. A lot of the smoke evaporates, and I think that's and putting focus on what to read, that is a difficult thing to accomplish, right?
Yeah, very difficult subject of great, this is the thing, students always complain every year that the reading list isn't right. It's very, very difficult to do.
It is a very difficult thing to do.
I very much respect you for having done that for however many years.
Yeah. And well, moving on, we have three more questions. Is it okay? I mean, do you have time for? I mean,
yes, go for it.
1 more minute. It's okay.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can close it on within the hour. So on AI and poverty, right? You wrote a paper titled "Making Ends Meet in a Super Intelligent Slum: Artificial and Economic Precarity in Nicoletta Valorantis il Cuore Finito (DDR). Could you tell us a bit about this paper? I really tried, because I wrote a paper as well on AI and poverty, right? But I couldn't find, I don't know if it's published or something, but could you tell us a bit about this? I'm very fascinated with the connection with this.
Oh, well, I'd love to hear about your work as well. That would be brilliant. I'm thanks for bringing this up. I wrote it a long time ago, so I've got some notes.
Okay. Sure. Go ahead. I know how it is. The time passes.
You can't remember.
It's good to reread.
The temporality of academia, anyways. You write something and then 2 years later it gets published. By which point you completely disagree with what you've written. But luckily, no one reads it, so it's fine. The paper was me trying to think through some different ideas. That have now been really important. I think firstly, I was funded by the EU, and what they said was, you need to write about science fiction in Europe. And people always think that science fiction is only Asimov, it's only Golden Era, and it can only possibly come from the States. Science fiction may not be indigenous to Italy, but it's certainly there in the gialli. It's interlinked with detective, with other kinds of genres. And that's quite exciting, these kind of interesting hybrid novels that result from the influence of Anglophone science fiction. Equally, I looked at Spain and France, and it's this kind of similar situation. And what I wanted was, and what Italian readers were desperate for, was an apocalypse that happens in Milan, not in New York.
Oh yeah, I see where it's going. That happens also for us over here. Yeah, it's
but of course,
New York or LA, right? Like
and then sometimes maybe there's like a flash to a scene in Mexico, and there's like people running around, really and they
filmed
it. Sure, but it doesn't happen there. It's not the nexus of the issue. So it's a post-apocalyptic futurity in this book called Il Cuore Finto (DDR), by Nicoletta Valorani, who's actually an academic herself. And in it, the main character is she's this fantastic ex-sex bot turned e-waste. She's now a fugitive e-waste on the run.
Okay.
She was discarded into the kind of dump pile, and then she was tinkered around with by someone who found her on the street, who wanted to create this super intelligent creature. And then he got bored and kind of, had to leave her. And she wakes up, she's incredibly ugly. She is very detached from standards of beauty, which in Italy, there's a kind of cult of la donna. Everyone has to be, I don't know whether you've watched Italian news, but the women are all very, it's a thing. And so in this future, feminized beauty makes no sense anymore. In capitalism's dumping ground, which is what's really happened with this area of Milan in this post-apocalyptic future. And what's really exciting about it is you have this kind of weird sort of semi-AI creature who makes friends with the community, solves their problems as a detective, and uses different ways to try and build a non-formal economy, an informal economy in Milan. And so I was interested in what scalable cooperation, connection, organization, skill sharing looks like in a slum community in the future. And this feminist principle of responsibility, which is Donna Haraway. She looks at responsibility as being responsive, which is a really interesting idea in AI anyway, as we're trying to work out what it means to be responsible for your products. So DR is responsive to the needs of her community, and she manages to navigate this really interesting kind of interspecies cooperation, which is what we're going to have to do when we live with AI. And certainly if we get to AGI, artificial general intelligence, what does it mean to live with other kinds of critters? And even, now, if you look at Catherine Hale's and other great philosophers' work, she argues that we need to understand all kinds of, all kinds of processes of thinking, so our conscious thought even, as being reliant on non-human cognition, non-human cognizers. Yeah. So we need to not think, okay, there's human cognition on the one hand and then technological cognition on the other. Technological cognition is underpinned by human cognition, or the people that do not only the data labeling that I've talked about, but do the machine learning, that do the engineering. Equally, human cognition is dependent on non-human cognizers, including technology. And that's something that is really interestingly worked out in this book.
Wow, sounds fascinating. I'm sorry, I'm having, it's so much concept, and it's amazing. I would love to read it if you would be happy to share it. And I understand that it's been a long time. Don't worry about it. Just go
ahead.
The ideas would be really nice. And of course, I'm happy to share what I wrote. I don't know if it's any good. You'll be the judge. But I think I made a serious effort to look, to investigate with the tools I have, right? Because I have some access still to JSTOR, for example, from my previous work in academia. And I tried to look for cases where poverty has been, and the poverty and the marginalized have been impacted by the development of AI. And I found it very difficult to find, work on this. There's not a lot of it. That's why I think it's very valuable.
That would be amazing.
Yeah,
I would love to read some of that.
Perfect. I'm happy.
I think class, as I'm sure, class analysis is now really underthought in not only in AI, but generally, like ageism in AI. It's not thought about enough. So that would be great. You should definitely contribute to that.
Yeah. I looked at some examples in Chile, here in South America, and some examples in Kenya, in the Africa.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Of like, and what are the Chilean examples?
Yeah, I'll let you know. I'll send the whole thing.
Tell me after.
yeah, I'll tell you. But essentially, it's about the when computers first began to arrive in Chile, and it's I found some work from a professor over there that he was looking at how could it go wrong? Because people were so happy that computers were arriving, but then he asked some tough questions. I think you're gonna enjoy that. But let's move on, because I know you have a podcast as well, so you ask great questions, and I could keep going. So the last two questions are about Mindshop, right? Our knowledge society. That as I told you, we're already it's 870, 880 people. We are in 270 cities around the world, like 27 countries. So it really grew. And also on this format, we are logically, it is not a place here in Monterrey. I live in Monterrey in Mexico. It's much more of a virtual space, but the community has grown. It's thriving. We're very, very happy. And it's all but based in philosophy. But we also teach math, we teach physics, we teach climate science, etc. So here's the question. I think people these days don't take the time to care for those trees that take hundreds of years to grow, right? And my intention with Mindshop is precisely this. I want this society to flourish and last longer than any of us. And on this note, many thinkers, philosophers, scientists have gotten in trouble by studying and teaching philosophy and science over the years, right? So how could we as a society have a significant and constructive impact without sharing, let's say, the fate of Socrates or Aristotle or a whole series of people that have gotten in trouble? And in other words, how can we stay independent from governmental and corporate agendas?
Well, we are never separate from government. I think it would be really naive to think that we are completely separate. We're totally not. The academy is extremely corporate. And once you're here, you will know, that the funding, the politics, it's very much attached to other institutions and processes. There's a great book on the history of funding at MIT that shows, I think it was in 1987, that MIT drew in over $400 million worth of US defense funding. Now tell me that these institutions don't direct research. It's the same everywhere. I personally am really picky about I'm lucky enough to have been able to choose incredibly, nice, innocuous funding bodies. Person that funds me now, she's lovely. She is a property developer in Hong Kong. I think that's okay. It's important work. Same in our next funding partner is Mercator, which is a Berlin-based funding body that also do, invest in interesting companies. However, CFI Leverhulme funded. We are indebted to them and their history, and it's not always been great. It's just, but to be aware is so important. And I was listening yesterday to David Foster Wallace's, that great speech, This is Water. And he says, we've got to constantly remain critical, remain aware, not necessarily critical as in, hating on stuff, but as in critique, as in being sensitive to these power dynamics. Like, Donna Haraway, this amazing feminist philosopher, says we need to stay with the trouble. And that means we need to not pull away from it, but explore exactly how we're related to all these different tensions between, if you're looking at medtech, for example, there's lots of interesting power dynamics there. And on the one hand, we have these amazing new technologies and drugs that have made life livable and longer for many people. But at the same time, that has had devastating, crushing impacts, the way that pharma has operated. It's the same with the academy. And we need to stay aware of it, teach it, remain critical of it. Otherwise, our students will hold us accountable. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. It's interesting response. Like there's no such thing as being independent. There's always some kind of, and of course, in this academic context, is that a book that you mentioned? The history of funding at MIT? Or it's a paper?
There is. I'll send you the book after. I can't remember what the name is. Okay. I just remember that particular figure.
We've all heard that phrase, like follow the money, like the money is the root of all evil.
Yeah.
And on this paper, I'll send you I look at some of the lobbying that Facebook, Google, Apple, many companies have been doing, how much they're investing, and it's in the trillions trillions of dollars. So it's
I know. I know, and I totally, I really sympathize with people who have moved over. I could do the same job as I'm doing now and get paid 4 times as much at Google. So I get it. And you can't blame people for making those choices differently. People have different kind of commitments and, things that they need to pay for.
Yeah.
But
ways of living and desires.
Sure.
It's very complex.
Yeah.
So our last question is about the future. Let's imagine that our knowledge society fulfills this vision. We last for a considerable long time. And imagine this is like a message in a bottle. What message would you like to send to these future learners when it comes to thinking about the world and understanding the world, thinking properly about the world? Eleanor? Hi.
I'm here.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good.
We lost your...
I think I would implore them to look back kindly on previous generations and be empathetic and give us the benefit of the doubt of what we did. As with, looking back at previous generations and climate change, it's hard to not be angry.
I'm sorry, Eleanor, give me a second. I think I lost you there. Give me a second.
A couple of minutes.
Okay, I'm sorry, Eleanor, we had a technical problem. Please, you were saying about looking kindly on previous generations. Please go ahead.
Yes. So if I had a message I had to send back, I would implore other generations to look back kindly and empathetically and give us the benefit of the doubt. But also, I would want it to be the other way around. I think that the future generations will have way more to teach us. I hope, particularly, about knowledge, look at what young people have contributed, conversations around algorithmic injustice and bias. I think that, as Shulamit Firestone said, we suffer from terrible ageism, not just towards older people, but towards much younger people, that only we can teach them something and they can teach us nothing, and you have to go through formal education and be schooled. We've had 5-6-year-olds here in the UK give really heartrending, really interesting and informative speeches on why their perspective on climate matters. And it's the same with AI. I mean, Sneha, the girl I was talking about before, she's 16 and she's fun. Her organization managed to block this terrible bit of AI software that was being used in jails and in courts in the US that disproportionately recommended young Black men would reoffend. And she's only 16. So I think that we really need to do a better job of also listening back the other way.
That's
I'd love to, what do you think? What do you think that?
I asked this question because I haven't really decided on an answer yet. But and wow, now that you say it, I think I skipped one question about the question you make on your podcast, right?
Sure, the question of good technology. Yeah, and it's actually the kind of that, in that we have no idea. But it's a really boring question we ask people. What is good technology? It is. It's terribly, and I think that there's something in those boring questions that when they're asked, people realize that they then have to break it down, and everybody says, well, what is good, and answers it in very different ways.
I think that and we're just opening a whole big new conversation. I hope we can do this again sometime. I think it's a great question. What is good technology? Because people often define good technology as a technology that makes money, and that is very problematic.
Do they?
Many people do that. Yeah, if it makes money, it's good. Well, at least that's a perception I notice on this side of the world. And
sure.
What's the role of technology? And I think it's fascinating that you do this. I'm very happy that you agreed to this interview. Thank you so much for your time. And I know
no worries.
You have to go. I hope you have a great week, and let's stay in touch. Thank you very much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.